A billionaire yells at a black waitress in front of everyone, thinking she's beneath him, but when she replies with just one simple sentence, the entire restaurant goes silent, and his life changes forever. The restaurant shimmered with golden light as people whispered and glanced toward the corner table. Everyone in the room knew who had just walked in it was Mr. Richard Harlow, the billionaire investor who owned half the companies in the city. His presence filled the air like thunder. His suit was sharp, his voice louder than anyone else's. He never waited for anything, and he never smiled. He clicked his fingers, and the manager rushed forward, bowing slightly. "Welcome, Mr. Harlow, your usual table is ready, sir." The billionaire nodded and sat down with a heavy sigh, looking around impatiently. He was used to control, to power, to people obeying before he even spoke, but this time the waitress assigned to his table wasn't nervous. She was calm, quiet, and graceful. Her name tag read Maya. She walked over holding a small notebook and said softly, "Good evening, sir. May I take your order?" Richard didn't even look up. He waved his hand and said, "Bring me your best dish. And make it quick." He scrolled through his phone, tapping the screen with irritation. The other customers glanced nervously at the scene. A hush fell over the tables nearby. When Maya returned with a glass of water, she placed it carefully before him, but his phone slipped slightly and the water spilled on his sleeve. He jumped up, shouting loudly, "What is wrong with you? Do you have any idea who I am?" The restaurant froze. All eyes turned toward the shouting man. The manager started to hurry over, but Maya raised her hand calmly. Her voice was steady, gentle, like a soft breeze. "Sir, I'm sorry for the accident. Please allow me to fix this." He glared at her, his face red with anger. "Don't touch me," he barked. "I should have you fired right now. You're nothing but a waitress." The air grew thick with tension, but Maya didn't flinch. She picked up a napkin and wiped the table. Quietly, her movements were slow, respectful. She looked up at him and said in a tone that carried warmth, not fear, "Sir, I understand you are upset, but may I say something?" The words seemed to confuse him for a moment. He folded his arms, glaring. "Fine." He said coldly, "What could you possibly say that matters?" She met his eyes calmly and said, "Then I will say it after you finish your meal, because words mean little when hunger speaks louder." He stared at her, surprised by her composure. No one ever spoke to him that way. Yet she didn't challenge him, didn't argue, just stood there with quiet dignity. When she turned to walk away, one of the older guests at a nearby table whispered, "That girl has courage." Another said, "She has grace." The billionaire sat down again, still frowning, but deep inside, something small stirred, a faint sense of discomfort he could not name. The restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm, though every whisper still carried his name. Mr. Harlow leaned back in his chair, still fuming. The arrogance in his chest felt heavy, but the silence around him made him uneasy. He glanced at his watch, tapping the table impatiently. When Maya returned, she carried his dish carefully balanced on a silver tray. The aroma filled the air, and people could not help but glance toward her calm movements. She placed the plate before him with a small smile and said softly, "I hope it meets your expectations, sir." He picked up his fork and took a bite, expecting perfection, but something about the food made him pause. It was simple, comforting, and real, not the usual luxury he was used to. He looked up and said bluntly, "This is not fancy." Maya nodded politely. "No, sir, it is not. It is made from fresh ingredients grown by local farmers. I thought you might like something honest today." Her words were strange, yet they lingered. "Honest," he muttered under his breath. He looked at the plate again. Somehow, unable to complain further, the simplicity touched something in him, a memory, perhaps long buried, of his mother's cooking years ago before wealth had stolen warmth from his life. He pushed the plate aside, but Maya gently said, "Sir, you didn't finish your meal. It would mean a lot to the chef if you did." He frowned. "Do you always speak this way to customers?" She smiled slightly. "Only when they seem hungry for something more than food." For a moment, the billionaire felt his defenses crumble. He opened his mouth to reply, but words refused to come. He had spent so long being obeyed that he had forgotten what humility felt like. Maya turned to leave, but he said quietly, "Wait." She stopped and looked back. He sighed heavily and said, "Bring me the name of the farmer who grew this food. I might invest in his business." She smiled. "That would make him happy, sir. But perhaps you should meet him first before numbers blind you again." Her tone was soft, not insulting, yet every word carried weight. It was the kind of truth that healed instead of hurting. The billionaire blinked, confused, and said, "What do you mean?" She looked at him with kindness. "Sir, not everything worth growing has a price. Some things grow only when watered with respect." The words echoed in his mind as she walked away. The dining room continued buzzing with quiet talk, but his world had gone still for the first time in years. He felt small and strangely at peace. Later, when the manager came to ask if everything was fine, Richard simply said, "Leave her. She is doing her job better than anyone else ever could." The manager nodded, surprised, for he had never heard his boss speak kindly to a worker before. As Richard finished his meal, he looked at the empty chair across from him, where his wife used to sit before their marriage had collapsed under the weight of his ego. Maybe Maya was right. Maybe hunger was not always about food. When he stood to leave, he noticed Maya helping an elderly couple carry their coats. Her smile was genuine, her hands gentle. He realized there was strength in her calmness, something he could not buy no matter how much money he had. He left a large tip on the table, but she quietly slipped it back onto his bill before he noticed her note beside it said, "True kindness does not need to be paid." The next morning, the city glimmered under a pale sunrise. Mr. Harlow sat in his office high above the skyline. Yet his mind was far from business. The memory of the calm waitress lingered in his thoughts. Her voice had followed him home through the quiet of his mansion. He had not realized how empty the silence had become until now. He stared at the reports before him, numbers, profits, growth, yet none of it felt alive. He sighed, pushing the papers away, and muttered, "I have built everything except peace." By afternoon, he found himself driving back to the same restaurant. He told himself it was just for another meal, but deep down he knew it was something more. The manager looked startled to see him again. "Sir, welcome back. Would you like your usual table?" He shook his head. "No, I want the one near the window." When Maya approached, she seemed unsurprised, as if she had known he would return. She smiled. "Good afternoon, sir. Did you enjoy yesterday's meal?" He nodded slowly. "I did more than I expected." She poured him a glass of water and said softly, "Sometimes it takes an empty stomach to hear the heart." He looked at her puzzled and said, "You speak like someone who has seen much of life." She smiled faintly. "I have served enough tables to know that hunger wears many faces." He asked quietly, "Tell me something, Maya. Do you really believe people can change?" She looked at him directly. Her eyes were calm, steady. "Yes, sir, people change when they start listening instead of speaking." Her answer sank deep into him like a pebble falling into still water. He wanted to laugh, but couldn't. He had shouted, commanded, and ordered his way through life. Yet in front of this simple waitress, he felt small and strangely hopeful. They talked a little more while she worked between tables. Each time she returned her words carried warmth, not flattery, but truth. At one point, she said, "Sir, sometimes the richest hearts belong to those who have the least. It is never about what we own, but what we give." He nodded silently and said, "You sound like someone who has lost a lot." She paused before answering, "Maybe, but loss teaches us how to hold on to what truly matters." When his meal arrived, it was again simple, a plate of bread, soup, and herbs. He asked, "Did you choose this for me again?" She smiled. "Yes, sir, the same food reminds us that gratitude tastes better every day." He tasted the soup slowly, feeling its warmth spread through him. His chest tightened with emotion. He hadn't spoken to anyone like this since his mother had passed away long before his empire began. After finishing his meal, he stood up and said quietly, "I would like to know your story, Maya, if you would allow it." She looked uncertain for a moment, then said, "If you truly wish to listen, sir, I will tell you after my shift ends." He agreed and waited patiently for hours, something he had not done in years. When the lights dimmed and the last guest left, Maya came to sit across from him with tired eyes, but a peaceful smile. She said softly, "I once worked for a man who yelled at everyone like you did yesterday. He was powerful, but lonely. He thought fear was respect until the day his daughter stopped calling him father." Mr. Harlow felt his heart sink. She continued, "When I served you, I saw the same storm in your eyes that he carried for years. So I spoke not to anger you, but to remind you that storms only calm when someone decides to listen." He could not find words. Only a heavy silence filled the air. Then he asked quietly, "Maya, what happened to that man?" She replied, simply, "He realized too late what he had lost. I hope you will not do the same." The weight of her words settled over him like a gentle truth. He nodded slowly and whispered, "Maybe this time I will not." Days turned into weeks, but something within Richard Harlow began to shift. He no longer shouted at his employees or barked orders in the boardroom. His voice softened, his steps slowed. The man who once measured life in profit now began to measure in peace. He started small. He visited the local markets where farmers sold vegetables grown with care. He spoke to them with respect and paid them fairly. He began supporting local charities quietly under a different name, so no one would call it charity, but rather kindness returned. As his company employees noticed the change, he greeted them by name, asked about their families, listened to their ideas. The fear that once filled the office began to fade, replaced by a strange new feeling they could not name: hope. One afternoon, he called his assistant into the office and said, "Find out more about that waitress from the restaurant. I want to help her somehow." The assistant nodded and left within days. He returned with a file. Richard opened it carefully, reading the details. Maya Thompson, single mother, living in a small apartment, raising a young son, studying part-time at night, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Richard closed the file. Slowly, a deep ache stirred in his chest. He had spent his life chasing power, while people like her carried strength in silence. He whispered to himself, maybe she has been the real teacher all along. That evening, he drove to the restaurant, but did not go inside. Instead, he watched from his car as Maya laughed with her co-workers, helping them clean the tables. She looked tired, yet happy. Her smile carried warmth that wealth could never imitate. The next morning, he visited her apartment block. He left a sealed envelope in her mailbox containing a note and a scholarship certificate for her son. The note said, "For the one who taught me how to listen, thank you." He did not sign his name. A few weeks later, Maya found the letter. Her hands trembled as she read it, her eyes filled with tears. She knew instantly who it was from, but she said nothing. Instead, she folded the note carefully and placed it beside her son's picture, whispering quietly, "Some hearts change because they finally hear the truth." Meanwhile, Richard continued visiting the restaurant. He sat quietly at a corner table, never demanding, never rushing. When Maya approached, she smiled warmly and said, "Welcome back, sir." The usual. He nodded with a small smile. "Yes, please, and thank you." Those words, "thank you," felt strange on his tongue, yet beautiful. They carried a weight of humility that no amount of money could buy. One evening after closing time, he stayed behind to help the staff move chairs. Maya laughed softly. "Sir, you don't have to do that." He smiled gently. "Maybe not, but it feels right." She looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You are not the same man who once yelled at me." He nodded. "I had to lose my pride to find my heart." She smiled. "That is the hardest trade in the world, but the most rewarding." They stood together under the soft glow of the lights, while the city outside whispered with distant rain. 2 souls once divided by power, now joined by understanding. For the first time in years, Richard felt free. Months passed, and the restaurant grew more popular than ever. Word spread quietly that a billionaire often dined there and treated everyone with respect, but no one believed it until they saw it themselves. The man who once filled rooms with anger now filled them with gratitude. One bright afternoon, the restaurant hosted a charity lunch organized by the city's business council. Cameras, flash journalists filled the space, and guests whispered as Richard Harlow entered the hall. Beside him stood the restaurant manager, and at the far end of the room, Maya served drinks to the guests, as always calm and graceful. When Richard saw her, he smiled warmly and nodded, but before he could approach the microphone, a reporter stood up and asked loudly, "Mr. Harlow, is it true that this is the place where you once shouted at a waitress?" The room fell silent. Every camera pointed at him. Richard froze for a moment, then took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, it is true. The same waitress taught me what it means to be human." The reporter pressed further. "What exactly did she say that changed you?" The crowd leaned closer, waiting for an answer. Richard turned toward Maya and said softly, "Why don't you tell them yourself?" Maya looked surprised, but he gestured kindly. The microphone was brought to her. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. The cameras zoomed and the air felt still. She spoke clearly, her voice soft but strong. "Sir did yell at me that day." She paused, looking at Richard, who smiled gently. "But I did not see a rich man yelling. I saw a tired heart begging to be heard. So I spoke to his heart instead of his anger." A hush spread across the room. Her words seemed to melt the noise around her. She continued, "We all face storms. Some of us hide behind money, some behind pride, but storms end only when we choose to listen." The entire hall was silent. Even the reporters lowered their cameras. For a long moment, no one moved. Then applause erupted loud, and heartfelt people stood up clapping, cheering, not for wealth, not for power, but for humanity. Richard stepped forward, tears glistening in his eyes. He said softly to her, "Thank you for giving me back the man I lost long ago." She smiled, "And thank you for proving that change is never too late." After the event, Richard established a foundation in her name, the Maya Initiative, dedicated to empowering single parents and hospitality workers across the country. Together, they built scholarships, housing programs, and food centers, touching thousands of lives. One evening years later, Maya visited Richard's mansion with her grown son. They shared dinner and laughter like family. As the night drew quiet, she looked at him and said softly, "You changed the world because you decided to listen." He smiled, "You changed me first." They raised their glasses under the golden light of the chandelier, two souls connected not by money or position, but by understanding. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and the stars glowed gently above. The world had indeed fallen silent, but not in fear, in respect for two hearts that had found peace. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional tales of kindness, change, and humanity.